Mark in Chicago. Hey, Mark, thanks for listening to WCPT. What's up?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. Just thinking about your question of how we can end the Trump/Republican death cult, and I think if we cut them off from their one true love, the drug that they live for, which is money, and if we can dismantle Citizens United, get rid of super PACs, strengthen the Federal Election Commission, I think that would go a long way towards, having a Congress that actually does what we care about, like clean air and water and public education and health care, rather than just sucking up to their billionaire class donors.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. And you have to go way back before Citizens United, though. In 1886, in a case called Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations are not persons and may not speak as persons, do not have rights as persons. The clerk of the court, a fellow by the name of John Chandler Bancroft Davis, very wealthy Massachusetts Brahmin. His father was the governor of Massachusetts prior to that. Very, very rich man. The clerk of the court, in the head note, which has no legal authority, wrote that the court, that outside of the hearing itself, outside of the ruling, that anyhow, his last name was Waite. I think it's Morrison Remick Waite, W-A-I-T-E. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And John Chandler Bancroft Davis wrote in the head note to that case, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, that the Chief Justice had said, there is no disputing that corporations are persons. We all agree on it. And in fact, that it was an out of context quote. It had nothing to do with the case, and he wasn't talking about corporate personhood under the 14th Amendment. But that head note, even though it had no legal authority, has been cited over 40 times by the Supreme Court, including in Citizens United. And so, number one, you've got the 1886 case in which the court decided that corporations are not persons, but ever since 1886, the court and the legislature have dealt with corporations as if they were persons because they based everything on the head note and not on the decision, number one. And then number two, in 1976. In 1972, Richard Nixon put Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court. A year earlier, Lewis Powell had authored the famous Powell Memo, although nobody knew this until '73 when Jack Anderson exposed it, in an article he wrote for the United Press, and that ended up in the Washington Post. And in his memo, what Lewis Powell had said to Eugene Sindor, his neighbor and friend and the head of the Chamber of Commerce, was that rich people and corporations in America have to stop being politically neutral and have to become politically engaged with specifically the Republican Party, with the right, and that they have to take over the schools, particularly the colleges. They have to take over the courts, and this led to the establishment of the Federalist Society to create right-wing judges and right-wing lawyers. They have to take over the media. They have to help consolidate the media. They have to start owning individual congressmen. They have to work for legislation to do this. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? The Powell Memo, he laid the whole thing out. And then 4 years later, in 1976, the Supreme Court, in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, the decision written in part by Lewis Powell himself, who Nixon had put on the court. Lewis Powell wrote that corporations and billionaires who give money to politicians or who fund political campaigns, even if the campaign, let's say the corporation is a coal company and they want to fund a campaign to convince people that it's just a fine thing if the coal companies dump their waste in rivers, which is, by the way, the first piece of legislation that Trump signed, allowing for that to happen. That if they do that, that is not a political campaign contribution. That cannot be covered by the 1974 and 1975 good government laws that came out of the Frank Church Committee's investigations. Instead, he struck down all those laws, and they said this is First Amendment constitutionally protected free speech. And so the two cases that you have to deconstruct are 1886 Santa Clara, 1976 Buckley. And if those, and the only way to do it, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, Congress could do this, but they're not going to because they're in the pocket of all these guys. The only way to do this is to amend the Constitution to say Number one, corporations are not people. That neutralizes the 1886 case. And number two, that money is not speech. And that neutralizes Buckley. And it also neutralizes everything that followed Buckley, including Citizens United and McCutcheon and you know, et cetera. There have been several of them. First National Bank versus Bellotti in 78 was another one. That was, you know, in 76 it dealt with persons. In the Buckley case, in the Bellotti case, it dealt with a bank, with a corporation. Both cases, the Supreme Court ruled, with Lewis Powell pushing for it, the corporations, that money given to, whether it's by an individual, a billionaire, or by a corporation, money given for political purposes is considered free speech. And until that happens, and that's why the work that Move to Amend is doing is so critical. And I'm going to be keynoting their conference, by the way, on Saturday in Washington, D.C. this weekend. And I will be there. And so if you want to learn about this whole story, I'm pretty sure it's going to be carried on Free Speech TV and some other venues. And but also, you know, if you're in the D.C. area, I see you're in Chicago, but you know, you can catch it. But it's going to be real interesting. Saturday night, I'll be in D.C. at the Move to Amend conference, and the website is movetoamend.org. And I'm not being compensated for this or anything. This is how much I believe in what they're doing. I'm flying out there to do this gig for them, and on my own nickel. I think it's this is the big issue of our time, Mark, and I think you've identified it. And that is that without money, these guys don't have power, and without that power, they can't continue the kind of behavior that they're doing, whether it's Scott Pruitt taking apart the EPA or Ryan Zinke taking apart the Interior Department and selling off our public lands to billionaire and foreign, you know, mining interests and things. You know, we've got to get the money out of politics. Mark, thanks for the very spot on.